All right, I just want to get this out there while it's still fresh in my mind. So I've gone through chapters 3 and 4 of manufacturing consent, and some big things. These are heavily, these are chapters breaking down very major and consequential examples of the types of things that they're arguing about. And so the two big things, and I know that I talked about part of chapter 3 in a previous discussion, where the coverage of ally versus enemy stories are different in major ways, but chapter 4 is one that I'm really concerned about because it's something that we see a lot of today, and so it essentially breaks down the idea of, or the story of, the Bulgarian Connection. And so this is the story of the assassination attempt on Pope John in the 80s. I think it was 1982, maybe 1981. And forgive me, part of the reason why I want to talk about this is because it is so detail-oriented that I want to be able to speak to it while it's still fresh in my mind, and hopefully to firm up those details so that I can communicate this better going forward. But at the very least, to make sure that I had a more accurate version captured, in case down the road I forget some of these details. So the big thing in chapter 4 is talking again about the Bulgarian Connection, but as it speaks to the propaganda machine type of issue, really the main thing is that the newsworthy thing happens, and the mass media co-opted a framework for the story that was based on a ton of problems, disinformation, incorrect sources, and a ton of speculation. And it kind of goes back to some of these ideas that are put forth in this book of relying on government or experts to provide information, versus journalists taking their jobs seriously and doing the work. And so I want to try to get the names because it would bother, right? We have today anchors, right, news personnel covering these things. Like, these people become famous, they're like celebrities, they're rich and wealthy, right? And it's supposed to be that it's because we trust them and that they're doing the right thing. And in this case, there are 3 main people that totally go against this. So probably the most guilty in this has to do with Claire Sterling. Claire Sterling was sort of the first story, and her framework is ultimately the framework that shapes this entire narrative. And she wrote in Reader's Digest in 1982, The Plot to Kill the Pope, and was the most important initiator of the Bulgarian Connection. And then, and its ideas and those of Paul Hentz formed the basis for the NBC TV program, The Man Who Shot the Pope, a study in terrorism, narrated by Marvin Kalb. So those three people, Claire Sterling, Paul Hentz, and Marvin Kalb, shaped the entire narrative of this story. And it's crazy. So throughout the book, they refer to the SHK. They call this the Sterling Hentz Kalb SHK model, in which the shooter, this guy Agca, AGCA, was an agent of the Bulgarians and indirectly of the Soviet Union. And so the SHK model had the following elements: motive. Sterling's article, the preeminent motive was a Soviet desire to weaken NATO, to be accomplished by implicating a Turk in the assassination of the Pope. This is something that we see today with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. A lot of that. There's a ton of emphasis placed on the idea that the Soviet Union, Russia's motive is to weaken NATO. Number 2, the proof of Soviet and Bulgarian involvement. Before Agca's confession and his identification of Bulgarians in November 1982, which, let me get out in front of and say, was proven to be false. A false confession and probably coerced out of him during his time in prison. That confession was 17 months after he was arrested. And these links, like SHK relied on this fact that he stayed in Bulgaria in the summer of 1980, and that Turkish drug traders with links to the Grey Wolves did business in Bulgaria. He offered no credible evidence and named no witnesses to any dealings with the Bulgarians, so that the new evidence was simply Agca's assertions after 17 months in Italian prison. And the third essential element of the SHK model was ideological assumptions, and this is a huge one, and this is one that I look at a lot today. As the case looked extremely thin, especially before Agca's new confession in 1982, the gaps were filled by ideological assumptions. This is the speculative stuff that we see today. This is the kind of thing the Soviets do. The Soviet Union and Bulgaria have been actively striving to, quote, destabilize Turkey. If there is no hard evidence, it is because the Soviets are consummate professionals who cover their tracks and maintain plausible deniability. The KGB hired Agca in Turkey and caused him to use a rightist cover to obscure the fact that he was a KGB agent. So here's the thing. At its essence, the SHK model suffered from a complete absence of credible evidence, a reliance on ideological premises, and internal inconsistencies. When these problems came up throughout the progression of the story, as his time in prison went on, and as the court case went on, and in the conclusion of that case, when the problems that poked holes in the original narrative came up, they shifted their grounds, and sometimes completely reversed their arguments, but never addressed it. So they would never admit when they were wrong. They would shift the goalposts. Alternative perspectives were completely ignored, right? All of these different things. And the details are very complex. The SHK model really wanted to tie this. It was a Bulgaria-Soviet connection, right? And throughout this, because of this, Sterling was very critical of the CIA and the US government for not being more proactive in standing up against terrorism. It's a huge claim. And so if they had acted based on what she was reporting and the stance that she was taking, that would have entered us into a significant conflict and probably a war. And like a war based on her coverage of this story, based on ideological assumptions and not evidence. And so people could have died for this. And so at the end, I just noted, like, people would have died. Like, we can't brush this off just because that wasn't the result. Like and importantly, throughout the process of covering this, right, they were strong in their conviction that this was the story and they were right. They're saying things, and they never addressed where they fell short. They never looked back at their early claims to see how they stood up against the test of accumulated evidence. Newsweek had reported that we have substantial evidence that Agca operated in close contact with the Bulgarians, proven false. The New York Times editorialized on October 20th, 1984. Agca's accounts of meetings with the Bulgarian officials are verifiable and important in important details. If there was substantial evidence and verifiable details, why was this evidence not produced in the courtroom? Why, after an enormous further investigative effort, was there still not enough evidence to sustain a conviction? They couldn't do it. It wasn't there. It was made up. In June 1983, Diana Johnstone, the foreign editor of the newspaper in these times, submitted on an op-ed column to the New York Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer that summarized the evidence and claims of intelligence agency visits, the reported threats to Agca that his open and pleasant prison conditions might be terminated if he remained uncooperative, and Martella's proposed deal with Agca. This op-ed offering was rejected, and no commentary or news along these lines was permitted to surface in the Times or the Philadelphia Inquirer or elsewhere to our knowledge. there was evidence of agencies interfering with the case, people visiting Eka in prison, coaching him to try to implicate the Bulgarians in this. Things like Paul Hentz, right, as in the H in the SH whatever model. He was a longtime CIA official who had been the head of the CIA station in Turkey and a specialist in propaganda. Former Turkish head of state Bülent Ecevit even accused Hentz of helping destabilize Turkey during his term of operations there. Hentz never refers in his news articles to his active participation in Turkish affairs as a CIA official. His writings are notable for their consistent apologetics for military rule in Turkey, for their dishonesty, and for the fact that Hentz openly disdains the use of rules of evidence in proving Soviet villainy. And Hentz was also a regular television guest. It was never once mentioned, that title, on television either. So, all interesting.